And thank you for joining us for our webinar tonight on the Chesapeake Bay. My name is Danielle Sims. I'm a program manager here at our DEQ Central Office. One of the goals of our education series is to share more information about DEQ programs and resources with the public. You can visit deq.virginia.gov/edu series, all spelled out, to watch previous webinars, to view content, and to learn more about future webinars. Thank you for your time tonight to learn more about DEQ's work for the Chesapeake Bay. Tonight, I'll be moderating our chat box for any questions you may have. Gwen McCrae in our Northern Regional Office will be our speaker for this webinar, guiding you through our presentation on the Chesapeake Bay. And then we are also joined by Megan Summers-Viscone, our Chesapeake Bay Planning Coordinator, Mara Christian, our Chesapeake Bay Outreach Coordinator, and Kevin McLean, our Chesapeake Bay Program Manager. And all three are here to answer any technical or specific questions you may have. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gwen.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for being on this evening. I think that those of us who are on the presenter side are going to go ahead and turn off our videos. That way we can protect a little bit of bandwidth and just make sure that everyone can see and hear everything smoothly. So we are going to start out just with a quick walking you through some of the parts of the WebEx platform. So at the bottom of the slide, there is a mute and unmute icon on the slide, and you should find something similar on your screen. However, this evening we are going to be keeping everyone on mute, and we will be taking questions in through the chat. There are some parts of the presentation during which we will ask you some questions, we'll get some interaction, we'll get some ideas from you, and so you can also use the chat to type your responses at that point. You can see the chat is going to be a small speech bubble, and you may need to, usually it's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you may need to click on the three dots there to find that window. Please feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat at any point. We will be monitoring those questions as we go. We will have a couple of question breaks, so we will be stopping and pausing at certain points during the presentation to answer some of those questions, and so that our subject matter experts can answer your questions. Please note that our staff tonight will not be able to address any questions about specific projects or permits during this presentation. For the sake of time, we may also not be able to get to every question that is asked tonight, but our staff will individually follow up with all questions that are asked but not answered via email to make sure that everyone's question is addressed after the presentation. Also later this week, we will be following up with everyone who registered for the webinar via email. That email will include a handout that is summarizing key points of the Chesapeake Bay programs at DEQ that we highlight during tonight's presentation, as well as a PDF of the slides and some important links. So again, if you have any questions, let us know as we go, and let's move on to chat a little bit about kind of what to expect this evening. So this is an introductory level presentation about the efforts to protect and preserve the Chesapeake Bay. We're really thankful to have our colleagues here as subject matter experts to answer questions. We are first going to be looking at some general information about the Bay. Then we will talk about some of the federal and state roles in protecting the Bay, the efforts that are taking place at the federal level and at the state level. We will also be talking about plans for moving forward. So as you may already be familiar, or you may learn that tonight, but as you will come to know, some of the goals for improving the water quality in the Bay have a deadline of 2025, and there's been a lot of work to assess where we are now in 2025 and to make plans for what comes next. So we will be talking about that. We're going to wrap it up with some ideas from you and some ideas from us about ways that you yourself can protect the Bay. And throughout it all, we will be offering some resources. Some of those resources we may put into the chat with links that you can that you can link to from the chat to open up a browser window, but we will also be sending you those in the handouts that we're sending later this week. All right, so with that, I want to just go briefly over what we hope that you will take away from tonight's webinar. So first of all, we hope that you will learn something new about the Chesapeake Bay. We know that the Chesapeake Bay is a beloved aspect of life in Virginia, and so some of you may be really familiar with the Chesapeake Bay. Maybe you'll learn something new tonight. And we also hope that you will share your love of the Bay and the things that you know and appreciate about it with each other and with us as well. We hope that you will recognize the way that the federal and state governments have varying roles in protecting the Bay. We are going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL. Don't worry if that seems unfamiliar to you, we will explain as we go. And we are also going to talk about Virginia's Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan, otherwise known as the WIP. All right. Final piece of introduction. In many of our programs at DEQ, we use a lot of acronyms. Acronyms are beloved by government workers and others. So I'm going to just give you a quick overview of some of the acronyms that you may hear as we go through. I will try to define them as I go as well. So the Chesapeake Bay, often we just use the shorthand of calling it the Bay, and we often use the shorthand of the Bay Act to refer to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. BMPs are best management practices for improving water quality. The CPB is the Chesapeake Bay Program. CZM is the Coastal Zone Management Program, of which DEQ is the lead agency in Virginia. DEQ is our Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. The EPA is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The TMDL, Total Maximum Daily Load, and a WIP, Watershed Implementation Plan. All right, so I think we have all of the intro slides out of the way. Let us jump into talking about some of the amazing things about the Chesapeake Bay. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed includes, as you can see on this map, portions of 6 states and the District of Columbia. The watershed is 64,000 square miles. It goes from Cooperstown, New York in the north, down to the salt marshes on the Virginia coast. There are at least 150 major rivers and 100,000 smaller tributaries, so those smaller creeks and streams that make up the Bay watershed. 80% of the fresh water in the Bay comes from the Susquehanna River, the James River, and the Potomac River. So those are the 3 main tributaries into the Bay. Also, more than 18 million people live in the Bay watershed. So you can see some of the additional maps that show us some of the things about or give us some perspective on the Bay. In Virginia, about 60% of the Commonwealth of Virginia is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And Virginia has 4 major rivers that drain into the Chesapeake Bay. Those are the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York River, and the James River. So of course, there's more. We kind of start with a big view, looking at the entire watershed. We're going to get, as we go along, into much smaller views. In the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about some of the social and ecological significance of the Bay. And you can see some of that starting to be represented by some of the photographs we've chosen here of some typical views that you might see at the Bay. So I'm going to spend a couple of slides talking about various ways that the Chesapeake Bay is incredibly significant and important in a variety of aspects. First of all, when it comes to history of the United States, history of this area, the Chesapeake Bay contains many, many important sites in U.S. history. It is the location of the Jamestown settlements, so some of the earliest settlements on the North American continent. There is also a lot of history of maritime traditions and sort of seafaring cultures, as well as being kind of the meeting place in North America of three cultures, of the indigenous cultures, the colonial European cultures, and Black culture of folks who were enslaved during our history. There are also lots and lots of important cultural aspects to the Bay. It has been the Chesapeake Bay has been recognized by Congress as a national treasure and a resource of worldwide significance, which I think if you have visited the Bay, you probably have seen why. There are just a plethora of traditions and cultures of many communities. This is an example of a photo of the Four Brothers Crab House on Tangier Island, which is an incredibly unique culture, as are many of the other communities around the Bay. When we think about the huge variety of cultural celebrations and language dialects, and of course foods that are typical of the Chesapeake Bay, I imagine that any of us could probably come up with a pretty long list of important cultural aspects of the Chesapeake Bay. The Bay is also very important economically. It is a major shipping port. The Port of Virginia is the third largest port on the East Coast, with about 14% of the shipping of the East Coast. In 2024, nearly 2 million shipping containers went through the Port of Virginia. The estuary of the Bay supports commercial, recreational, and subsistence fisheries, tourism, as people who want to visit places of natural beauty and have encounters with nature and wildlife. There are many beautiful natural landscapes that folks can visit on the Chesapeake Bay. The Bay also supports important public infrastructure, of course, in addition to being a harbor and port for both Virginia and Maryland for shipping and transportation. There's also green infrastructure projects that are provided by the Bay as well. Of course, seafood and fisheries is a very big industry with our most famous fisheries of blue crabs, oysters, and rockfish, and tourism. Recreational fishing in particular, and boating, but all kinds of ecotourism, cultural and heritage tourism, along with the associated hospitality, restaurant, and other industries. Tourism and recreation is a major industry for the Bay as well. But one of the reasons that we are here tonight is also to talk about the environmental significance of the Bay. So the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States. Now, an estuary, for those who may not be familiar with that term, is a partially enclosed coastal body of water, where fresh water from rivers and streams mixes with the salt water from the ocean. So estuaries, in a way, are transition landscapes or seascapes, it's the transition from land to sea, the transition from freshwater to saltwater. So estuaries provide a lot of critical habitat. There are thousands of species of birds, mammals, fish, and other wildlife that depend on estuaries. Environmental services such as filtration of pollutants, that's another aspect of estuaries that's incredibly important. And estuaries also act as protective buffers from the action of the water that may cause erosion, but when you have an estuary, that slows that water energy down so that it slows down erosion processes. So the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States. It's the third largest estuary in the world. 1/3 of the Atlantic coast's migratory birds winter over on the Chesapeake Bay, including 87 species of water birds. So there's just an incredible biodiversity of all kinds of wildlife and plant life in the Chesapeake Bay. The watershed, as I mentioned before, is 64,000 square miles and stretches all the way up into New York to 6 states and the District of Columbia. It includes major cities, agricultural areas, suburbs, industrial areas, mountains, forests, and coastline. According to the Chesapeake Bay Program's land use and land cover data, about 3,000 square miles of the Chesapeake Bay watershed are covered by impervious surfaces. And some of the issues with impervious surfaces include an increased proportion of pollution runoff, the speed of runoff, and water that gets diverted from soaking into the soil and instead goes directly into our waterways, which can in turn impact the water quality. So the water quality in the bay is an incredibly important factor as we think about what we want to do to protect and conserve the bay. So the water quality standards that we use at DEQ are in the implementation of the Clean Water Act. They support a variety of designated uses, including drinking water, recreation, fish consumption, and support of aquatic life, for example. We do have other educational webinars about water quality. If that's something that you are interested in learning more about, I encourage you to take a look at that. So in the complex ecologies of the Chesapeake Bay, the quality of the water in the bay and in its tributaries is of central importance. So we've kind of gone over just a quick view of some of the reasons that the Chesapeake Bay is important. I want to take a quick pause and ask you all to add some ideas to the chat. So if there are things that you can think of as you think about what your experience has been with the bay or what you've learned about it in the past, what are some of the things that are important to you, important to your communities about the Chesapeake Bay? So I would love to hear from you. I'll pause for a second while people have a chance to gather their thoughts and put things into the chat. All right, I see some answers coming in. Please continue to put those in. One of them is having less development along the waterways. So how important it is, right, to have those tributaries and waterways that give us good water quality as they make their way to the bay. Sailing on the bay, some of the best experiences of my life. That sounds lovely. Growing up along one of the tributaries of the bay, the Choptank River, wonderful. Softening the blow of storms on the shoreline, absolutely. Agriculture in the watershed, definitely, and the importance of best management practices, those BMPs. Protection of bird migration paths, yes. As I mentioned, the bay is a really important stop along the paths of many migratory birds. Summer camp at the bay, so it sounds like people have had lots of great experiences in their childhood and their adulthood, sort of thinking about everything from very personal experiences to the way that collectively we can come together to protect the bay. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide, but I really appreciate hearing so much from you about how important the bay is for you. So let's talk about that, right? Let's talk a little bit about water quality in the bay. So in the mid to the late 20th century, water quality issues in the bay became pretty pronounced, including reductions in water clarity, where you couldn't see through the water as well anymore, algal blooms, and reports of declines in fisheries. So this prompted a study that was funded by Congress, and it was published in the early 1980s, and it found several things. It found, first of all, that there had been indeed significant declines in fisheries for oysters, blue crabs, rockfish, otherwise known as striped bass, and shad. That study also found that there had been a loss of aquatic vegetation, that there were toxic compounds and heavy metals in the water, and that there was an overabundance of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, most likely from agriculture and wastewater. So these problems with the bay water quality that were identified by that report led to a lot of work and cooperation at the federal and state level to improve that water quality. So the Chesapeake Bay program, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Chesapeake Bay program and some of the initial work that they had done. So this is just a timeline to kind of get us oriented about when these things happened, and then I will get into more detail in the subsequent slides. So the Chesapeake Bay program is a regional partnership, quite unique in its composition, and that Chesapeake Bay program has led and directed the restoration of the bay since 1983, when the Chesapeake Bay Agreement was first signed. In 1983, the governors of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, the mayor of the District of Columbia, the administrator of the EPA, and the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission signed the Chesapeake Bay Agreement of 1983. In 1987, there was another Chesapeake Bay Agreement that set specific numeric goals for improvements in water quality. In 2000, the headwater states, so the additional states that are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, joined the partnership. So that was New York, Delaware, and West Virginia. In 2009, President Obama signed an executive order to reinvigorate efforts to improve water quality in the Bay and to establish 2-year milestones to be accountable, to provide some accountability for making progress on that improvement. And then in 2010, the total maximum daily load, the TMDL for the Chesapeake Bay, was published. And in 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement was signed. So those last two, the 2010 TMDL and the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, are a couple of the things that I'm going to be focusing on as we move forward. So the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, the Chesapeake Bay Program, is a partnership that includes those 7 jurisdictions that I mentioned before: New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia and West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. It also includes federal agencies, local governments, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations that are all directed towards restoring the Chesapeake Bay. The program provides a wide range of assistance, both technical assistance and financial assistance, to states and local governments, non-governmental organizations, and academic institutions to further efforts to improve the Bay. It is managed by EPA through its Chesapeake Bay Program Office. And our the NDEQ also participates in that Chesapeake Bay program. All right, so I told you that I would explain the TMDL and the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. Let me start by explaining what a TMDL is for those of you who may not be familiar with it. So a TMDL is a water quality study and a planning tool that does a calculation to find out what kinds of pollutants might be impacting a body of water, and what is the maximum amount of that pollutant that that body of water can accept and still meet water quality standards. So again, there's a lot that goes into that. Water quality standards and the Clean Water Act are a whole webinar in and of themselves. And we won't get into it a lot tonight, but again, I encourage you to ask questions or reach out to us or take a look at some of the resources. So basically, a TMDL includes the best estimates of pollutants from non-point sources, which are sources that are basically runoff from the land. So that's often stormwater is a really good example of that. Natural background sources, because sometimes we have elements that may impact water quality that were not put there by human civilization, but just happen to be naturally occurring. Pollution from point sources. So that would be anywhere where you have a pipe with a discharge that is going into a body of water. And it also includes some calculations about seasonal variations and things like that. So on the slide that you can see right here, on the left-hand existing load, that would be, this is the amount of pollutant that is currently in the water body that is impacting its water quality and making it not be able to meet the water quality standards. What we're looking for with a TMDL is to find what is that amount that of that pollutant that the water body can accept while still meeting those water quality standards. So the black line across the top is the water quality standard. With a TMDL, we consider what load allocations are acceptable, and we also include a margin of safety because we want to make sure that we stay underneath that water quality standard. So the TMDL load allocation, which is going to include both the point sources and the non-point sources, is going to be well below that water quality standard line so that we have a margin of safety. So what does that mean for the Bay? So in 2010, the EPA established the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL. This was a historic and comprehensive pollution diet. It is the largest ever TMDL developed by EPA, and it encompasses the entire watershed of 64,000 square miles. It is a it had the goal of and the scope of restoring clean water to the Chesapeake Bay and also to the region's streams, creeks, and rivers. So the TMDL identified three specific pollutants and the loading capacity of those three pollutants that can be present in the bay and still achieve the applicable water quality standards. So the TMDL set bay watershed limits for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So what they recommended, or what they called for in the TMDL, was a 25% reduction in the amount of nitrogen entering the watershed, a 24% reduction in the amount of phosphorus entering the watershed, and a 20% reduction in the amount of sediment entering the watershed. So when the TMDL was established, the monitoring data continued to show that the bay had poor water quality and degraded habitats and low populations of many species of fish and shellfish. And they adopted the Chesapeake Bay TMDL to ensure accountability for reducing the pollution, these three pollutants, and improving water quality for those purposes. So the Bay TMDL also uses a framework of accountability, because it's one thing to say this is what we need to do. It's another thing to say how are we going to do it? How are we going to hold ourselves and our other states accountable for doing so? So the Bay TMDL uses an accountability framework that includes watershed implementation plans, which I will talk about subsequently. It includes 2-year milestones. So we kind of have points at which we can stop and take stock of how much progress we've been making and make a goal for the next 2 years. EPA does tracking and assessment of restoration progress. And also there are, in the TMDL, federal contingency actions in the event that the jurisdictions in the TMDL do not meet their commitments. So in many ways, the things that we've been talking about up until now have been some of the major efforts at the federal level and at the watershed level, and kind of having those Chesapeake Bay agreements among all of the or the Chesapeake Bay program partnership among all of the states and Washington, D.C. We will be transitioning into talking in a little bit more detail about what Virginia specifically is doing. But before we do that, I'm going to pause to see if we have any questions in the chat yet. And if you have a question but haven't put it in the chat yet, now is a very good time for you to go ahead and do that. So we'll pause for just a minute while folks have a chance to put their questions in the chat.
One question, Quan Watershed Monitoring Lab in Manassas is showing some indication that the Prince William County is showing some quality challenges. Would the bay be a source, not the primary source? So if any of our subject matter experts are able to answer that question, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Hey, Glenn, this is Kevin. I am I'm not sure that I understand the question as it's posed. That first one, ironically, um,
Sure,
I might
yes.
have.
Yeah, so Sunny, maybe if you can clarify a little bit what you're asking or what information you're looking for in that question, that would be fantastic. And then yeah, I think Danielle may have other questions that we can answer in the meantime while Sunny is maybe adding some context to his question.
Sure. I have a little bit, this is a longer question. Um, Biosolid, parentheses, sewage sludge from cities has been spread for decades as fertilizer on farmland and forests all across Virginia. We're finally learning how toxic this sewage sludge can be, containing PFAS and microplastics, which migrate into the bay along waterways. DEQ, particularly the Water Control Board and the Office of Land Application Programs, has always had a lot of different powers to test, regulate, and reject or accept the sludge, but they have not exercised their powers. They always say they have to wait until they get marching orders from EPA. Obviously, the EPA is not going to do anything meaningful in the next 3 years to protect us from toxins found in sewage sludge. So it becomes more and more urgent for DEQ to embrace their authority to police this practice. Until they do, they're out of compliance with state law, which requires biosolids are handled in a manner that will protect public health and the environment. So the question here is, are you all concerned, as I am, about the contributions of land applied sludge in terms of substances known and unknown to the Chesapeake Bay's TMDL? If so, is there anything you all can do to put pressure on DQ's coworkers to convince them to do something about biosolids?
Danielle, I'm happy to take this one, and in part, I will say that yes, we're very aware of the risk that PFAS pose to the health of the Bay watershed, and we are currently working on amending our Bay Agreement to kind of update and modernize some of the language in there, including a focus on how we can better idea share amongst the jurisdictions and tackle this very broad, very diffuse issue. Obviously, the application of biosolids is just one instance of how PFAS end up in the waterways. Um, I will also add that Virginia passed legislation last year to begin to develop better ways to track data on PFAS and manage those applications. At DEQ, we have built over the last 6 months a new PFAS team, bringing some new folks on board to manage and track that data. Um, and within the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, we're going to be continuing to research and understand those impacts. That doesn't mean we're going to be pressuring coworkers to change their stance or their policy on it. We're going to use the best available science to inform those decisions as we move forward.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Next question, what are the enforcement mechanisms for the Bay Agreement?
I'm happy to just keep going if you want, Danielle.
Sure.
So, Paul, that's a great question. For the most part, the Bay Agreement and the partnership that it informs is a voluntary partnership amongst the Bay jurisdictions, EPA, and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. What really is our enforcement mechanism, so to speak, is the Bay TMDL, that total maximum daily load. That is the legal enforceable goal that we must reach as a jurisdiction. That's that accountability framework that Gwen was speaking of, and we, along with EPA, have to hold ourselves accountable to reach those goals. Now, what's interesting about that and how the Bay Partnership works is that most of the work that we're doing, most of the projects we fund, and the federal dollars and state dollars that we use to support the Bay program and work, that's all voluntary work. So we're asking landowners, partners, state agencies, localities, whoever it may be, to pursue that work to help improve the Bay. Then there is the completely kind of separate from the work we're doing regulatory and enforcement side of what DEQ and EPA do that kind of act as those enforcement mechanisms. Now, that is not specifically part of the Bay Agreement, but it is part of the whole structure of how our environmental protections and our natural resources agencies all work together.
Okay. Next question, what are we doing about the placement of treated sludge on agricultural fields near the water?
Danielle, this may be a refer to Neil Zarodka and his team type of question to get down in the weeds on specifically what DEQ is doing about that.
Sure. We will follow up with you individually after the webinar regarding that question. Next question, what role do local elected officials play in this, and how are they being educated?
That is a great question, and I would love to defer to Maura on that one, who represents us with a lot of our local officials.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I was about to do the same. So it varies in the area of the state, specifically in areas east of 95. The Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act localities are engaged because they have their own locally enforceable Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act programs. So they would be engaged in that way. But on a bigger scale in the Bay program, watershed wide, with all the states, there is a local leadership work group that brings together perspective and voices across the watershed. They're also in the Bay Agreement is a local leadership outcome that has specific outputs that we are working towards to engage and disseminate information relevant to the Chesapeake Bay in our goals. So more I could certainly share in that. There is also a resource online called the Protect Local Waterways. It's got a whole bunch of different adaptable PowerPoints and graphics to use to be able to educate your own local officials. So lots of tools out there, and I'd be happy to connect more offline to share more.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Next question, is there any penalty for failing to meet TMDL goals?
Yeah, so that's going back to that kind of TMDL and accountability framework answer from earlier. So the that would be legal action on the part of EPA amongst the jurisdictions, and that has happened in the past when a jurisdiction is not achieving the reductions in nitrogen or phosphorus or sediment that they're supposed to achieve. The goal, I would say, at all times is to be ahead of the curve and doing the work we're supposed to do, so that it does not get to that point. But that can happen where legal action is taken to push a jurisdiction forward, to put them into a consent decree where EPA can actually kind of take over ownership of the work that jurisdiction is doing. I believe that's only happened once before, and we're gonna continue moving things forward. And I would say all of the jurisdictions now really are getting very much up to speed and are fully on board with the work of the Bay program.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm following up on that Prince William water question. Does the Bay contribute to any water quality challenges in Prince William water?
Yeah, so Sunny, I think I would say it's the other way around, if anything. So Prince William is located within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So the things that happen on the ground and that run off as stormwater, rainwater, effluent, whatever it may be in Prince William County, do make their way downstream and into the Bay. So that would be, I would say that Prince William would be a source of contributing potentially nutrients and sediments to the Bay, and not the other way around, if I'm understanding that question correctly.
Okay. Is there any penalty for failing to meet TMDL goals?
I think we covered that one,
You did?
Danielle.
Okay, sorry
Yep.
about that. Last question, do you have a microplastics team, or do you plan to implement one? This person specializes in microplastics, and the statistics are absolutely terrifying.
Jamie, that is a fair point and a good question. To my knowledge, Virginia doesn't have a microplastics team. I know that both DEQ and VDH do invest some time and resources into understanding that. And that is one of the risks to the health of the Bay that is specifically being called out in new draft language that may go into the amended agreement in December. It would not, in the way it's written right now, it would not be a specific measurable goal or target for microplastics. It would just be under the umbrella of toxic and emerging contaminants that we want to keep kind of advancing our understanding of. That's a thorny issue. It is, the source of those is so widespread and so hard to track back that I think we have a long way to go to developing a real targeted approach to reducing those.
Okay, those are the questions questions we have for now. We have a few more question breaks throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Gwen.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone for those questions. We really appreciate it when questions that come to mind, you put those in, and then we can continue the discussion in that way. And we really like that. So let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. We are going to be talking about the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So Kevin mentioned a little bit about the revised agreement, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But to give you some background before we get there, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement was first signed in 1983. There have been multiple versions, and the most recent version was signed in 2014. It was updated in 2020. And the goals in the Watershed Agreement are set for 2025, and we are now in 2025. So what the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement does is it establishes very specific goals and outcomes for the restoration of the bay, with that focus on water quality, for the restoration of the bay and its tributaries and the land that surrounds them. So the signatories to the agreement include representatives from the entire bay watershed. So again, all of the states that are encompassed in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. That committed for the first time with the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, the watershed agreement, that all of the headwater states, so not just those that were bordering on the bay, but those that were in the headwaters up in Pennsylvania and New York, are included as full partners in the Chesapeake Bay program. So the agreement, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, named adaptive management as a core principle, and adaptive management is a process that helps support decision making in the face of uncertainty. So we can't have full knowledge of what is happening or what will happen, and so adaptive management reduces some uncertainty over time, as it is a way to respond to the unknown and to changes as they come. So the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement established 10 goals organized within 5 themes to advance the restoration and protection of the Bay watershed. Those 10 goals also include, each of those 10 goals have specific outcomes attached to them. So there are 5 themes, 10 goals, 31 outcomes. Before I tell you what they are, I want to again pause and see if anyone already knows what some of those goals are, or if you have a guess. If you had to guess what some of the goals in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement are, what are some of the things that you think would be included or ought to be included in something like that? I'll pause for just a second and give folks a chance to put their answers in the chat. All right, oyster population restoration. Excellent contribution. Any others? We'll give folks a minute to finish typing. All right, reduction of nutrient loads, water quality improvements, and fish habitat protection. Fantastic. Yeah, so those are reduction of fertilizers, riparian buffers. Very good. So those riparian buffers, that's a great example of one of those management practices that we've talked about. So keep it coming if you want, but I'll go ahead and start to show you what some of these goals and outcomes are. The first theme, abundant life, includes 2 goals. That is sustainable fisheries and vital habitats. So those of you who mentioned oyster fishery, I see there's a mention of the Manhattan fishing industry, fish habitat. So we are looking to, with these goals, we are looking to support strong, sustainable populations and habitats of wildlife. The second one, clean water. And so there we are looking for goals of improving water quality, decreasing and eliminating toxic contaminants, and having healthy watersheds. So it's not just at the bay, but it's all of the tributaries that contribute to the bay and the lands that surround them. The third theme is conserved land, and land conservation is another one of those goals. The fourth one is engaged communities. So we have several goals that are focused around our communities. So that includes stewardship of our natural resources, public access to the resources of the Chesapeake Bay and the watershed, as well as environmental literacy and helping people really understand the environmental importance and the significance and the ways that that our natural world works. And finally, climate resiliency is the last of those 10 goals. So climate resiliency, which is especially important for those folks who are in flood-prone areas along the shore where there may be some sea level rise, and that can really have an impact on communities. So the target deadline for most of the goals and outcomes in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement is December of 2025. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go into some additional slides where we're talking about kind of where we are now and what our plan is for moving forward. So before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about some of the specific things that we do in Virginia. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about so far have been at the federal level, or they've been those multi-state partnerships. But what has the Commonwealth of Virginia specifically done? And again, I think that I mentioned this at the top. This is an intro level course, webinar about the Chesapeake Bay. So we won't be, this is not an exhaustive list of the things that Virginia does, but these are some of the most kind of important and impactful things. So the Virginia Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act was enacted by the Virginia General Assembly in 1988. So the Preservation Act creates a framework for improving water quality in the Bay through effective land use management practices. So I think it's really important for us to remember that the way that water gets into the waterways is first rain falls on the land, right? So the land use and the way that we're using the land, the activities that we're doing on the land can have a huge impact on the quality of the water as that water moves from the land to the waterways. So the Bay Act creates this framework about thinking about water quality through those land use management practices. The Bay Act recognizes that it's actually local governments that have a primary responsibility for those land use decisions. So the state government is not making decisions about local land use. Those local governments are making those local land use decisions. And the Bay Act therefore expands local government authority to manage water quality, and it establishes a direct relationship between local land use and water quality protection. So under the Bay Act and regulations, DEQ's primary role is to provide oversight, local program oversight, to provide policy guidance and technical assistance when it's been requested or otherwise required. So DEQ in this plays the role of supporting local governments in achieving their water quality and land use management goals. The Act is a really important element of Virginia's non-point pollution source management program, because I think, as I mentioned before, non-point source pollution, or that storm, water runoff on that land use is, really integrally related to the kinds of land uses that local governments make decisions about. So some of the regulations provide, there are required elements and criteria that local governments need to adopt and implement in administering their Bay Act programs. As Maura mentioned, and correct me, Maura, if I'm wrong, not all of the localities in Virginia are required to implement these criteria. However, those that are close, like on east of 95 in particular, have these requirements. So some of the local Bay Act programs include localities generating maps that depict Chesapeake Bay preservation areas within their localities, identify performance criteria that apply in those areas, in those Chesapeake Bay preservation areas, that apply to decisions about the use, development, and redevelopment of land within those areas, that they have a comprehensive plan that incorporates the protections of those areas and the quality of water in the locality, that they have zoning or other ordinances that incorporate measures to protect the quality of state waters within the Chesapeake Bay preservation areas and require compliance with those criteria, that they have a subdivision ordinance that incorporates measures to protect the quality of state waters in the Chesapeake Bay protection areas, and to ensure that all subdivisions also comply with that performance criteria, that they have a plan of a development process before they issue building permits to assure that the use and development of land is accomplished in a manner that protects the quality of state waters, and that they publish on their websites the elements and criteria adopted in order to implement their local plans. So the upshot here is that the Virginia Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act both recognizes the authority of local governments to make their land use decisions, and also sets the requirements for what local governments need to do and need to take into consideration in order to protect the Chesapeake Bay water quality. All right. So another thing that we do in Virginia, and all of the other states in the Bay Partnership do as well, is to create a watershed implementation plan that is required in order to meet the pollution limits that are established in that Chesapeake Bay TMDL, or total maximum daily load. So Maryland, Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. all develop their own watershed implementation plans that detail how they will meet their pollution reduction goals. And each jurisdiction also submits 2-year milestones based on their progress. So the phase 3 watershed implementation plan in Virginia was completed in 2019. It details best management practices and actions that can be taken to achieve those target reductions. If you remember in the TMDL slide, we talked about what the target reductions were for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment entering the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So in a sense, watershed implementation plans are basically roadmaps for how the states, such as Virginia, will attain those goals in the TMDL. It also, as we mentioned, that the adaptive management approach in the Bay Agreement. So the watershed implementation plan commits to utilizing that adaptive management approach, as all the other Chesapeake Bay program partners have agreed to as well. So again, this is sort of our roadmap, the roadmap that we use to determine what the process will be for us meeting our goals and targets in the TMDL. So then we also have these 2-year nutrient and sediment reduction milestones. The EPA and the jurisdictions in the Bay Partnership have adopted pretty extensive measures to make sure that they are accountable for reducing pollution and meeting target dates for their progress under the Chesapeake TMDL. So as part of this accountability framework, the EPA and the Bay jurisdictions have developed short-term goals called milestones to increase restoration work and to ensure their progress. So the nutrient and sediment reduction milestones are part of that accountability framework to ensure that the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment allocations will be met. On January 15th, 2025, DEQ submitted its 2024 to 2025 programmatic milestones progress report to EPA. That progress report provided the updates on the key ongoing activities and our watershed implementation plan initiatives for a variety of areas, including goals that we have for agriculture, for wastewater and septic systems, for development of lands, for forestry, for the coordination across multiple sectors, and for trading and offsets. Now, each of these, each of these 6 categories encompasses a huge number of initiatives and activities and approaches of ways that we can work towards meeting those goals in our 2-year milestone and also in our WIP to get to the TMDL. I do encourage you, if you have specific questions about any of these, to pop those into the chat, and definitely take a look at some of the materials that we will be sending along to get more information about those. All right. So where do we stand right now? Just a quick update on where we stand for nutrient and sediment progress as far as our goals in Virginia. For Virginia, we have achieved an 84% reduction in towards our goal for 2025. So we've gotten 84% of the way. As far as phosphorus, we have achieved a 91% reduction of our 2025 goal and 100% of the reduction for sediment. So we have fully met the goal for sediment. So these goals were measured from 2009, which was as the TMDL was being researched, studied, and up until the most recent modeling network. Now, the other thing that kind of the other point of thinking about where we are, like what is our status at the moment, when we think about the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, again, there were 10 goals and 31 outcomes. 18 of those outcomes have been met by this year's 2025 deadline. The remaining 13 are either unknown status or have not yet been fully achieved. So starting in 2023, there's been work ongoing to develop recommendations for the next steps. What do we do now? So in 2023, they started thinking about it because we were getting close to the deadline. The deadline is coming up at the end of this year, and we want to be ready to assess where we are and move forward towards the next steps for the Chesapeake Bay. So we are going to talk about that, but we will take a quick question break because I have seen a few questions coming in. So we'll take a quick question break first, and then we will move on to talking about Beyond 2025.
2 questions come in during the presentation. One being, would land restoration, such as planting native meadows and trees, fall into the land conservation goal, stewardship, or healthy watersheds, or all the above?
Yeah, Andrea, that's a great question, and you're getting at kind of the complexity of the Bay Agreement and all of our outcomes, because it does kind of fall into all of those categories. It also falls into water quality and a couple of other categories as well. Ultimately, what you're comparing there are the kind of tools and the projects that we use to accomplish those goals. So those are the best management practices that we fund and support throughout the watershed in order to get us towards those land conservation goals, those water quality goals. And then wrapped up in those projects generally are some level of stewardship and education, whether that's getting volunteers involved, putting signage out on the site, having field trips come out, to see it. It can kind of cover that whole wide range. Yeah.
A few years ago, someone read about big commercial fishing ships that came into the bay and were allowed to take fish. Does it still happen?
Danielle, we're going to, I think, refer part of this question to some of our colleagues after the call. Joanna, both Maryland and Virginia have catch limits that are enforced annually, as well as different seasons for when fish products can be caught. We do also have a series of goals and outcomes within the Bay Agreement to try to, provide the water quality and the habitat and all that to sustain populations of those fish species. I am not expert enough to speak to the types of, commercial operations that are coming into the bay, what kind of ships are coming in. We'd have to follow up on that.
Okay. Last question here for now. Sediment is the #1 pollutant in the James River. How did sediment reach a 100% reduction if the James River is one of the major tributaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that 100% of our sediment goal being reached, that is for Virginia's whole portion of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We have reached the federal planning target that was set for us. So all of the rivers, not just the James, as they empty into the bay from Virginia, we have gotten below the benchmark that was set for us to reduce sediment. That doesn't mean that that sediment is still not a challenge to water quality at times, to water clarity and all that. That there's not still more reductions we want to make. We have actually set standards in our watershed implementation plan that go beyond that federal planning target that was set to actually continue to achieve reductions in the James and all of our other rivers for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So we'll keep working towards that. But in terms of the TMDL and the federal planning target that was set for sediment across Virginia's whole portion of the watershed, we have achieved that.
Those are all the questions we have in the chat box for now. I will turn it back over to Gwen.
Super, thank you so much. And again, thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. So we want to talk then next about what comes after 2025. So as we've mentioned throughout the webinar, when the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement was signed in 2014, many of its goals and outcomes had this targeted deadline of December 2025. And as I mentioned, many of those goals have been met, but not all of them. And as the date draws near, as we get closer and closer to December 2025, the Chesapeake Bay program is in the process of determining how best to meet the goals and outcomes while continuing to plan for the future of bay restoration. So there is the Beyond 2025 initiative. I'm not sure what the right word for that is, but there are a couple of elements of this Beyond 2025 as we look forward to what comes next. What are the next steps after December 2025? So in the first phase of Beyond 2025, there was a report that was produced called the Beyond 2025 report. That report was presented to the Chesapeake Bay Executive Council last December, so in December of 2024. That report recommended a recommitment to all 31 outcomes of the 2014 Bay Agreement. It also recommended a revision of those current outcomes, so an effort to look at them again and analyze them and potentially revise them, and a process for continued feedback, a streamlined decision-making process, and an assessment of the current way that the TMDL keeps folks accountable. What is the current TMDL accountability framework? So that was phase 1 of Beyond 2025. Phase 2 is the revision of the Bay Watershed Agreement. So after the Beyond 2025 report was presented to the Executive Council in December 2024, we began work on revising the Bay Watershed Agreement. So the revised Watershed Agreement will include a simplified and streamlined structure and process to support all of the partners as they work towards achieving their own commitments in an effective, efficient, and inclusive manner. There will be opportunities for public engagement on this revised Bay Watershed Agreement. There are management board meetings that are held to discuss the revised Bay Agreement. The next management board meeting will be on June 12th. Interested parties and members of the public are invited to email comments And we will include the email address in our resources. As well as that, there will be a public feedback period for the revised Bay Watershed Agreement this summer. So that feedback period will begin on July 1st. It will go, I'll let Kevin and Maura and Megan confirm the dates, but it will go for a couple of months in the summer, and then the feedback from the public will be considered, and there will be revisions to the watershed agreement draft in the fall. So there are opportunities for you to let us know, let the Chesapeake Bay Partnership know what kinds of things you would like to see in the next Bay Watershed Agreement, and to provide your feedback. And that would be much appreciated. We always want that public feedback. So it's really important for us to have the structures that we have in the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, in the Chesapeake Bay Program with the Watershed Agreement, those accountability structures, the Virginia Bay Act as well. It's really important that we have those. It's also important that we think about how each of us, as individuals, in our communities, collectively and by ourselves, can help to protect the Bay. So I have a list of, lots of suggestions of ways that you might be able to help protect the Bay. But as before, I would like to get your ideas first. So what are some of the things that, and actually, I think the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through and we're going to go category by category. So first of all, when we think about environmental stewardship, what are some of the ways that you all think you might be able, or you and your communities might be able to contribute to protecting the Bay in the, in the category of environmental stewardship? Best management practices for us. I'll give folks a minute while they're thinking about things and putting them in the chat. Okay, so some of our comments here. Look at water use in the growing data center sector and how that's impacting water quality and the Bay. Certainly any kind of water use, industrial water use, whether it's data centers or other sectors, that's definitely an important thing for us to keep in mind. And as members of the public, we can provide public comment, and especially going to those local government planning and zoning meetings where they're making those land use decisions that do impact the Bay. That's definitely a place where we can all have a pretty important voice. Other ideas, planting riparian buffers, absolutely. So for those who aren't familiar with riparian buffers, a riparian buffer is an area along a stream or a river or a creek where you have vegetation that maintains the structure of the bank next to the river or stream, and keeps erosion and sediment from getting into the stream. Doing litter cleanups, yes, absolutely, fantastic. I'll give you an example. I did a litter cleanup last fall, and it happened to be a litter cleanup that was right on an outlet into the Potomac River. So it was, direct shot down to the Bay from there. It also happened to be right where there was a stormwater drain that emptied out into a wetland. And so there was so much, just everything that had been washed down. The storm drain was there in that wetland and making its way slowly to the river, which would have made its way to the Bay. So definitely doing litter cleanups where we can keep trash, we can keep microplastics, but also, anything that might leach out of that trash into the water as well. Litter cleanups, stream buffer ordinances, absolutely. Doing education, sail and kayak more, motor less. I love that one. Get your paddles out. So yeah, those are some great, I won't read them all, but those, I encourage folks to keep an eye on that chat because you all have some great ideas. So another category, learning more about your watershed and the Bay. I did see that some folks had put outreach and education specifically to waterfront owners, which is definitely important. All of us can probably benefit from learning more about our native shorelines and about the Chesapeake Bay, for sure. There are a few places that you might think about going in order to get more information about the Chesapeake Bay. Of course, feel free to check out the resources on DEQ's website, and the Chesapeake Bay program has a very informative website as well. There are also lots of great museums and places to go along Virginia's shore in the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum is in Maryland. The Maritime Discovery Center, Nauticus, is in Norfolk. The Reedsville Fishermen's Museum in Northumberland County, and the Virginia Aquarium and Marine Science Center in Virginia Beach are just a couple of good examples. I see someone also mentioned the Virginia Master Naturalist Program. That's a fantastic place to go for a great education as well. So supporting restoration and education activities. There are lots of ways that we can personally contribute to restoration and education. You know, as an example, the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Fund, if your license plate is up for renewal and you decide that you want to buy a Chesapeake Bay license plate, that will contribute to the Chesapeake Bay Restoration Fund that supports environmental education. There are also, you don't have to buy a license plate, you can just contribute to them. But there are lots of great organizations and locations that you can look to support the work that they are already doing as well. I think that we probably had a couple, I feel like I saw a couple of folks mention something about reducing impervious surfaces. So I mentioned impervious surfaces earlier because there was the land use study from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that found that 3,000 square miles of the Chesapeake Bay watershed are impervious surface, which means when the water falls on an impervious surface, it runs right off. It cannot soak into the soil underneath. That creates problems with, it can create problems with erosion because that means that there will be more stormwater coming down faster. So it can create those kinds of problems. It can contribute to shortages in groundwater because we don't have water soaking into the ground and eventually making it into our groundwater aquifers. So there are some really great ways that you can reduce impervious surfaces by, for example, you know, I've seen there's someone in my neighborhood who has replaced their driveway with impervious bricks. Excuse me, pervious bricks. So rather than being a concrete driveway, they have bricks that will support the weight of the car, but also have holes in them so that water can get through and grass can grow up through it. I see someone recommended working with your local soil and water conservation district. That's a fantastic idea. They have a lot of really great resources and information and educational programs. So definitely checking out your local soil and water conservation district is a very good idea. Many organizations would love to have you volunteer and get involved. You can become a Bay advocate with, for example, the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay or the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. There are lots and lots of organizations that are doing great volunteer work around the Chesapeake Bay. Land conservation is an important one. And so if, for example, you wanted to work with Chesapeake Conservancy or the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, other land conservancies that are working to conserve lands that will contribute to improving water quality and meeting those TMDL goals. And finally, a clean water cost share, which I actually don't know very much about. And so if any of our subject matter experts have some information about that, I would definitely appreciate hearing about that. I will be looking more into what that clean water cost share is as well. But I appreciate all of your great ideas. I love that someone said collecting oyster shells from the restaurants. This is a great project for those who haven't heard of it. You know, one of the things that one of the activities or actions that's happening in the Chesapeake Bay is working to protect the oyster populations. And one of the ways that we do that is by collecting shells from restaurants and putting them back into the bay so that they can serve as nurseries for new oyster populations. So that's a really, you know, just a great fun way to think about ways that you can contribute to the Chesapeake Bay by going out for dinner. So yeah, I very much appreciate all those great ideas that you all had. I am going to go ahead and I think we're getting close to the end of our evening here. I just want to revisit quickly the objectives that we had for tonight. We do want to hear from you about whether you think that we have met these objectives. So I think that we will have a link in the chat to an evaluation. We will also include a link, or the evaluation I think may come up when you end the webinar. We will also have a link to an evaluation for this webinar when we send a follow-up email. We hope that you will take just a few minutes to let us know what your experience was. Let us know how we did. Did we meet these objectives? I certainly hope so. So as we wrap up, I'm going to go ahead and have a final question break before I tell you about some of our other webinars that are coming up later this year. So we'll go ahead and pause for our final question break.
Thanks, Gwen. I missed a question earlier, and it was, how does DEQ allocate its TMDL goal to localities?
Sure. Thanks, Danielle. And I'm going to tag team this with Megan, who works on a different side of this program, but I would interpret this question about allocating our TMDL goal possibly two ways. So we take the TMDL goal for the entire Bay watershed, and we have our own Virginia-specific goals through our watershed implementation plan that breaks down kind of in particular how, where, in which sector we're going to look to make those reductions in our pollutants. Also, there's another avenue that we work on the TMDLs, and that's through locally developed or local waterway developed implementation plans. That's through our non-point source team here at DEQ. I'd probably defer you to them for more questions, but there are these implementation plans that can be developed that lead to areas that are able to access additional funding to address those non-point source pollutions. So that's kind of the side of TMDLs that's more locally driven. And I would pass it to Megan to talk a bit about our milestones in Virginia.
Sure. Actually, I'm just going to mention too that I saw in the chat that Abigail had mentioned working with local soil and water conservation districts, and DEQ often works with those groups and other local groups to develop those implementation plans. So they're a great resource too to find out more about what's happening locally in your area. So milestones, I know Gwen touched on this earlier, that all of the Bay jurisdictions have committed to setting and working towards 2-year milestones, and those are for nutrient and sediment reduction. They're a part of the framework that we've talked about several times tonight, and it's EPA's way of ensuring that those nutrients and sediments allocations of the TMDL will be met. So the first milestones were developed around 2012. They were submitted by jurisdictions in 2012 for the 2012-2013 timeframe. We're currently in the 2024-2025 milestone period. I'm going to drop a link in the chat that has the historical milestones on EPA's website. Hopefully that'll come through for you. And then in a minute here, I'll drop our Virginia specific milestone reduction page. But so we're in the 2024-2025 milestone period. In January of 2024, we submitted our draft milestones to the EPA. EPA evaluated the proposed commitments and assessed whether or not we'd be able to achieve the reductions that we outlined in the watershed implementation plan relating to our milestones. So once we got their feedback and we finalized things, we worked through our milestones in 2024, and then after that midpoint, we submit another report to EPA. This one is our progress report, and that was for calendar year 2024. So we submitted that in January of 2025. Now we're working through the 2-year milestone, closing that out this year, and we will do a closeout report that will be sent to EPA in January of 2026 for the full 2-year milestone period. And we will talk about, our partners will give us feedback on what worked and what didn't, and maybe why, our successes and challenges. And then EPA will review the Commonwealth's progress. And they will also model estimated loads based on implemented practices that are expected to be at or below our jurisdiction's trajectory for meeting our targets. So they'll take into consideration, our BMP progress as well. And then, as was mentioned earlier by Gwen, 2025 was our target date, but now we're looking beyond there. And so we fully expect to develop milestones for 2026, 2027. It's been brought up through discussions with the Bay Program Partnership, but we don't have specifics yet, but we will be sharing those with the public once we have them. And I will drop the Virginia specific milestones page where you can see some of our more recent reports.
There's a follow-up question to that. How is the TMDL goal enforced against localities?
Emmett, I'm going to ask you to take that one because I think you have a better
Yeah,
fuller
absolutely.
aspect of that.
And that ties back to some of the questions from earlier. Through the Bay Agreement, the Bay Partnership, we're not enforcing actions against localities, so to speak. We are, through the framework that Maura and Megan just ran through, we work on that scale from the federal partnership down to the state level and then to our local watersheds with all of those partners. That can be localities, that can be planning district commissions, soil and water conservation districts, whatever it may be. To kind of get that work done, but then it falls on more the regulatory and enforcement side of our agency and a couple of our other partner agencies to make sure that they're following all of the kind of regulations and permits and guidelines that are in place. But that's a little separate from what we're trying to accomplish with this work. So hopefully that addresses what the question was about.
Thanks, Kevin. Another question here. What's the consequence of Virginia being at only 81% of goal for the nitrogen and 84% for phosphorus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we are in the final year of our planned goals, for reaching that 100% reduction, getting to that federal planning target. And we're unlikely on the nitrogen side to meet that by the end of this reporting year. We basically report our data on a state fiscal year. So we'll have, from June into June of this year, this year into July of next year to kind of get all that data in and finalize for our what we call 2025 progress. We'll be there for phosphorus, I think, because we're making some really big strides there, and we've been making record investments on the state level the last few years in our agricultural cost share programs, and we're really seeing the impact on our nitrogen reduction numbers over the last couple of years. What that means is we have already committed in the intervening years, there will be some time between the end of that 2025 goal and when the next version of the Chesapeake Bay model, it's the phase 7 version of the model, getting a little more in the weeds than I probably need to on that. That will be kind of the next iteration of these efforts. We are committing with some interim milestones to continue making strides toward those nitrogen goals and make sure we've achieved those. And if we don't do that, then we could fall back into that accountability framework and EPA kind of playing a role in helping us to get there. But I think we're on track. And we recognize there's been a lot of challenges over time, that have slowed some of those efforts, but we're making really good progress.
Great. Those are the questions I see for now. If anyone has a few more questions, feel free to put it in the chat. They've been great questions. But I'll turn it back to Gwen otherwise.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for putting questions into the chat. Thank you to our subject matter experts for answering those questions. Kevin had one of the answers to his question sparked my memory, and so I wanted to just run back real quick to talk about that clean water cost share. Remember, I said I wasn't sure what it was. I remember what it is. The cost share programs that Kevin mentioned are, many of those cost share programs may be for farmland, for agricultural use, but there are cost share programs across Virginia for all kinds of property owners, from residential to rural and commercial sites and farmland. Soil and water conservation districts are a good place to go if you're looking for some cost share program information. But they can be things like, those best management practices. It can be things like tree canopy, tree buffers that the Department of Forestry offers. For agriculture, you may be looking at livestock exclusion fencing or watering cover crops, nutrient management plans, and things like that. In the past, I've heard of, and our subject matter experts can tell me if I'm crossing my streams here, but I believe that I have seen some of the soil and water conservation districts in my area, Virginia, have some cost share programs for things like rain gardens or other investments in property that can do things like increase or decrease impervious surfaces, or slow down stormwater, things like that. So definitely take a look at if that's something that you're interested in. You can do find some good resources on those cost share programs all throughout the Commonwealth. All
Got
right.
a comment in the chat. That's the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, otherwise known as VCAP.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So, again, I just would, we're getting up to 8 o'clock, and I just again want to thank everyone for taking some time out of your evening tonight to join us. I hope that you've learned something new about the Chesapeake Bay and the efforts that we are undertaking in Virginia to improve the Chesapeake Bay water quality, to protect and conserve the bay. And I also want to thank our subject matter experts, our colleagues here at DEQ, who joined us to share their insights and information in the programs that they work on. So before we go, I just want to let you know about some of the other education series topics that we have coming up later this year. In September, we will be talking about water planning, and in December, we will be talking about funding sources and grants through DEQ. If you're interested in any of those, we encourage you to sign up for them. And if you're interested in looking at any of our previous webinar topics, they are all recorded, and you can get to them by taking a look at our education series page on the DEQ website. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Very much appreciate your time tonight. I see a comment in the chat about all of the notes that have been taken this evening to share with people, and I really, that's a great way to contribute to protecting the bay, is by learning more yourself and sharing your knowledge with other people. So again, thank you very much. Have a great evening, and we hope to see you in a future webinar.